Wrapping up this week, we are going to end chapter 7.5. This is actually 7.5 day 2. Yesterday we learned how to translate powers with rational exponents. We learned that the phrase rational exponent just means we have an exponent with what we call a fraction. Again, rational numbers are fractions and decimals. And so we learned that rational exponent means it's an exponent with a fraction. Our work yesterday taught us how to rewrite a rational exponent in radical form, where also we learned that the radical symbol is this thing here. So again, if you want a rational exponent, that means you want a fraction in the exponent. If you want a radical form, that means you want it in this form. Real quick review on that. We were asked to rewrite this without rational exponents, which means that they do not want fractional exponents. And so what we learned was to take the bottom number here, put it on the outside of the radical, and then put the base and the power on the inside. It was a very easy shift, and that was really all that there was to it. Now, what I explained was that there were two confusing types of questions that we need to make sure we review before the notes are over, because when the quiz comes up tomorrow, you are going to see these two types of questions on them. The first one, again, this 1/2 is outside of parentheses, and so it ends up dropping to both numbers, 4 to the 1/2, x to the 1/2. The thing about 4 to the 1/2 is that I can actually do 4 to the 1/2. Remember, whenever you do this, put the power in parentheses and end up with the number 2. So because 4 to the 1/2 can be simplified to be 2, the thing we know now is that they want it in radical form, which again, that is not a radical, that is actually a rational exponent, but the 1/2 only belongs to x, so it should be written as 2 square root of x. Keep in mind, again, square root, you do not write the 2, it's just a regular root with no number. Whereas on this one, because the 1/2 does not go to the 4 and it's already simplified, now you just go ahead and put your root x on the inside. Again, these two problems, and you might want to pause the video for a moment to write both of these down and study them, but these two problems have that major difference where one actually breaks down to be a 2, the other one stays as a 4. The x ends up in the root on both of them because of the 1/2 power, but it's just a matter of the fact that you distribute one of those 1/2s and the other one you don't. Today we're going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to translate from radical form to an expression in radical exponents, rational exponents. And it should be pretty easy considering what we know. We know that this number came from the bottom of a fraction, and so therefore this number goes on the bottom, and since there is nothing there, it means that there is a 1. So this would just be x to the 1/3, because again, from what we know, that is the denominator, and the inside power is your numerator. So it's just undoing what we did yesterday. Fourth root of x to the 7th. Again, your x is your base. This is obviously your denominator. That number would always be your numerator. It turns into x to the 7/4. So it's really not that tough in terms of the day, which is why it's a good Thursday lesson. The most important application of this, in terms of why we have to do it or why we want to be able to do it, is the ability to help us evaluate complex radicals. Our calculator does have, actually it doesn't on the button part, but I think the TI-30, the multi-view calculators do. But right now all we have is a regular square root, which means that if I was asked to find the 7th root of 128 and I don't have special programming skills, well, what I can do instead is turn this into a rational exponent and bring down my 128. The 7, of course, ends up on the bottom with a 1 on top, because notice that there is no power. And because of this form now, I can actually type in 128 caret 1/7 to find out that it simplifies to be just 2. And so again, because we can translate it, it allows us to do some work with the actual numbers. Fourth root of 6561. Again, I don't have a fourth root button on my calculator, but what I can do is put 6561 here. That being the bottom number means a 4 goes here with a 1 up here, and I can take my calculator instead of doing fourth root of 6561. I can do 6561 to the 1/4, which is 9. So again, that's one application. Another thing that you'll find out later in your algebra days is that it actually allows us to do some algebra with roots in terms of simplifying bases. But again, we'll talk about that. You'll probably talk about that in a couple years after your geometry. I understand the past couple of days have not been spent with lots of examples, but again, that's because the power rules still constitute the most important portion of the information, and I don't want to trick you into thinking that what we did the last 2 days is the most important part of this week, where the most important part of this week was the ability to take the something like x over 7 or x to the 7th over x to the 3rd and subtract and simplify those things. This still represents the most important part of what we've done the last 2 weeks, and I did not want you to think for some reason that what we are learning the last 2 days is it. The ability to translate between two forms is not going to be used a lot immediately. It is important that you have the concept because, as I said, pretty soon, or not pretty soon, but in a year or so, a couple years, this actually comes back into play. But because this has to do with the topic, they want to make sure that we at least see it so that you can actually apply it later on. So please use the rest of the day to practice the new information as well as prepare for the quiz tomorrow. Remember that there are only 3 more Fridays left in the quarter counting tomorrow. So you have tomorrow's quiz, you have the Friday after that, and you have a Friday after that, which is where you'll take your test, and that is your quarter. So if you are trying to get your grade under control, make sure you take the time to do that and start planning something, because what you don't want to do is wait until the very last week, because that's not the way you should do things if you actually care about your grade. Other than that, good luck.